Today's vlog is going to be about following warnings in Qigong practice. So if you've been practicing Qigong for a while, and probably more also if you've read a bit about Qigong, maybe from different sources, different books, different articles, maybe you've heard a few different people talking about Qigong, it's likely that you may have come across one or several different warnings about things not to do in your Qigong practice, or specific ways that you should do something, things to avoid, and so on. And I've talked about some of these sorts of things in this vlog before, because some of the warnings are more serious and more important than others. And for all of them, it really helps, if at all possible, to understand not just, what the warning is, but the why, the principles that are behind it, and why someone might give that warning. Because some of the warnings are really context specific. So for example, one of the relatively recent vlogs I made was about practicing Qigong in the wind. Because there are some people who say, never practice Qigong in the wind. But depending how you take that, that can be a bit of a strong restriction, and there is some context behind that as to how strong the wind is, how healthy you and how strong your energy is, and the effect that that's likely to have, and so on. And it actually turns out it's not that you can never practice Qigong in the wind. It's just that with some awareness, you can find the level of wind that it's okay for you to practice in, and then you understand. Now, does that mean you should just disregard that warning? No, it doesn't, because if you just disregard it completely, and your health or energy is not in a suitable state, and you practice in the wind that's too strong for you, yeah, that can have some unpleasant or even harmful effects. And the same is true of a lot of other warnings that you might encounter in Qigong as well. Saying, oh, you have to do it this way, or you can't do it that way, or avoid doing this. Often it's not that you can't do that thing at all, but that there's some context around it that you need to understand if first, right? Before you explore working with Qigong in those particular ways. And as I mentioned, some of these warnings are more serious than others. Some are, it's like, oh, well, if you do this, it might just, instead of building your energy up, it might actually tire you out a bit. Like, in the short term, that's not such a problem. In the long term, it might not be great because you're not getting the benefit that you'd want to from your Qigong. Other warnings can actually be, and sometimes they're quite small things, or they might seem like small things to someone who doesn't understand the context of them, the principle that's behind it. Others of the warnings are actually more serious in that, hey, if you mess with this kind of practice without sufficient understanding, without sufficient preparation, you can do yourself some real harm. And a lot of people just assume because, Qigong, most of the practices, they seem to be gentle. Not all of them, to be fair. There's lots of different types of Qigong practices, and some of them are very strenuous. But some, it seems like, all you're doing is you're using your mind or your breath, and, how could that possibly hurt you? Well, unfortunately, there is a reason for some of these warnings. And there's a reason why, there's lots of practices that you can do as a general practice, and other practices that are sometimes considered a more advanced practice, or that it's considered you need to take specific steps in preparation before you do these sorts of techniques, because they can cause real harm. And unfortunately, I've seen that. It's not common. It's not common at all for people to harm themselves by doing Qigong in this way. These are sort of edge cases out on the extreme. But I've been around for a while. I may not look that old, or on the other hand, depends on your perspective. Maybe I look really old, I don't know. But I've dedicated a lot of my life to Qigong practice and research. And as part of that, I've been in different situations, held different positions, where I've interacted with a lot of people, both Qigong teachers, Qigong students, and just Qigong enthusiasts who've come at things from different ways. And as a result of that, I have come across a number of people who've actually done themselves some real harm from Qigong practice. And it has, if I think about those different cases, it has universally been people who have just ignored the warnings. They've just decided that, hey, this, again, maybe what's generally considered to be an advanced practice or very strong practice, that they're just going to do it. You know, maybe they've read about it somewhere. They don't have an experienced teacher guiding them, you know, to help them navigate their way through any preparation that they need to make, any adjustment of their practice so it's suitable for them or adjusted to where they're at. And they've done themselves real harm. And that includes both physical harm and, unfortunately, also psychological harm. This is one of the areas where, it's one of the areas where there are, some of the strongest warnings, I guess you'd say, some of the strongest potential issues for harm relates to some of the psychological things that can come from Qigong practice. Now, again, these are not common at all. These are edge cases on the extreme. It's just that I've had very broad exposure, so I've actually, I've seen a number of cases of this where people have done this kind of harm. If you'd like some perspective on just, you know, how common these sorts of issues are and around that and the different types of dangers there is an article I wrote a while ago about the dangers in Qigong, and I sort of lay out quite a few things there, including how safe overall Qigong is. It's like, it's not something you need to be overly concerned about these sorts of harms, unless you're of the mindset of just ignoring warnings and just doing whatever you want anyway, right? That's where you can get into trouble, and I have seen it. Now, as I've said right at the start, this doesn't mean that actually all of the warnings that you might hear are complete restrictions that, oh, you should never do that, even though often they're voiced that way. Often it's a case of, well, dig a little deeper, understand the principle, and then you can understand how it applies, and so you can use wisdom in your own practice. Or, I guess related to that, find a knowledgeable, skilled Qigong teacher who can guide you through that, who can give you the advice and help you to understand that, and give you perspective on some of these things, on whether, hey, actually, really don't do that, or don't do it yet, or hey, actually, this is okay, you just need to understand this and guide your way through it. I think that's probably about all I have to say about the warnings. Some of the warnings can be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, but you need to understand to know whether it's one of those warnings, or some of the warnings you really need to pay attention to. You should really listen, and always, you know, if in doubt, seek some good advice before getting into something that maybe you don't fully understand. Anyway, that's the vlog for today. I look forward to seeing you on another one soon.